Today's episode is about cutting through all of the food noise around food and nutrition, something that affects us all regardless of what lens we normally view the world through. Now, I've personally noticed how easy it is to start living in an echo chamber. We follow people that reinforce exactly what we believe, what we already believe, what we want to believe. We listen to shows and read headlines that validate all of our current choices, and I am very guilty of this too. It is very rare that we listen to opposing sides, opposite views, and consider, have I been believing the wrong thing? Do I need to take on more information? I really feel that the truth is if we really, truly want to understand how our food choices impact our health, our families, our future, our country, we have to be willing to ask hard questions, even uncomfortable ones, and hear science-based answers from people who live and breathe the work. That's why I am so excited today and a little nervous, I'm going to be real, to interview somebody that I really admire, Dr. Jessica Knurick, and she's a registered dietitian and a PhD in nutrition science who specializes in chronic disease prevention. Now, what I love about her is she doesn't just throw opinions around. Some people might think they're just her opinions. They are deeply grounded in evidence. She is passionate about helping regular people like us make sense of complicated nutrition topics. Now, she herself does practice a lot of the nutrition things you've heard me share on the podcast, but she's got a very real view about what we need in this country and this world. This conversation today is not about politics or fear. I hope no one takes it this way. And I really want to start asking some hard questions and understand what's real, what's hype, and what's truly in our best interest. So thank you so much, Jessica, for doing this with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I reached out to Jessica, just a little transparency on this, because I thought I innocently was asking a question on Instagram. I said, I'm not really clear why people are upset about the food coloring ban. That's what I asked. And I was genuinely asking, what am I missing here? Why are people upset about that? What I wasn't prepared for was more than just getting some answers. I got a lot of hate and I got a lot of, how could you ask that? And this tells us where you are politically and what's wrong with you. And I thought, what am I missing here? And I'm owning up to feeling super naive here, that I didn't understand what I was missing. Now, a lot of people were super kind and chimed in and said, have you considered this? And they kept tagging you, Jessica. They kept tagging you. They said, follow her page. And I started following your page and I really started seeing things from a different perspective. And it became very clear to me that I have lived in an echo chamber. And I want you listeners to hear this too, because I think we all do this to some extent. An echo chamber to me, and I'm going to ask Jessica what she thinks that means to her. I think to me means we tend to surround ourselves with people that validate our own beliefs. And we start not seeing the opposite, or we think the opposite is dumb or wrong or evil or whatever that is. Jessica, I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I definitely agree with you that it's just easier, right? When we already have kind of an idea in our head, especially if it's been like ingrained in us for years and years. And it's easier to just kind of like hear the information that we already believe and just believe it. And then it's also easier to be critical of the information that maybe like we haven't kind of like thoroughly thought through or, had just had this belief that it's not right. I mean, I do this myself even, and I've had a lot of like beliefs that have changed, but I held on to them for a very long time. And then it's work, right? It's like this uncomfortable kind of like gap between like what we hear and then what we believe. And then figuring out, okay, well, where is the truth? And that can be uncomfortable for people. And people don't like to be kind of like live in the discomfort, right. I think. And so again, it's just much easier to kind of like latch on to what we already believe.
Yeah, I think we like certainty. We want the black and white answer. Like, this is the way, this is the only way. Can you share just a little bit about your background? I mean, you're no dummy. You've got a lot of experience here in nutrition. You've got your PhD. Can you share a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, sure. So I'm kind of like a lifelong athlete. That's what got me into this field. I played basketball in college. I played a bunch of sports growing up. So I was always very like interested in like that area, like being physically active. And then that kind of turned into, as I got older, just like staying really healthy myself. And so that kind of, I got into kind of that exact area of study as well. And so I got a master's degree in exercise science, and then my PhD is in nutrition science. And when I was going through my PhD, I went to a program that was this interdisciplinary program to look at how diet and movement and lifestyle can all impact our disease risk. And so my research was in the field of kind of preventing lifestyle related chronic disease, specifically looking at diabetes and cardiometabolic disease, so cardiovascular disease, and how we could use different strategies to help reduce our risk of those diseases. And what I found through and this is pertinent to just kind of like where I am today, what I started very much on just an individual level, like how can we optimize somebody's health to reduce risk of disease? And what I found as I was going through that research is that, the guidelines, the science that we have really good science to show like what kinds of like lifestyle related behaviors can reduce risk of disease. But what is missing is this adoption of these lifestyle related behaviors, right? And so the behavior change research shows really clearly it's very difficult to get people to change their behaviors. And that got me, so my dissertation work was actually in what's called easily adoptable strategies to reduce risk of disease because of this difficulty in changing behaviors. So I would take like, what's like the minimum thing we can get people to do to like actually have a meaningful impact on their disease risk. And so I used things like a fiber supplement, a psyllium husk fiber supplement. I used things like a post-meal walk, which was like walking just 15 minutes or after you eat a meal can reduce or attenuate postprandial hyperglycemia or the rise of blood sugar after a meal. And so let's do those things and let's get people doing those things. But that really started getting me interested in, okay, well, why aren't people adopting these things, right? And so that's what really took me from the individual side of wellness to, okay, when we look holistically, when we look from a public health perspective, why are almost no Americans following the guidelines? Like, what are these like barriers and systemic barriers? So after I finished my PhD, I was a professor at the University of Nevada for a couple of years. And then I transitioned out and started working in startups, working with their research teams and working more on the communication side of science.
What I love about your stuff, and I'm going to link everything about her below, obviously, is she really speaks out, but it's not the typical marketing clickbaity kind of speaking out. Like she speaks out and explains. So that's when I started looking at your content, I thought, okay, this is not just you trying to be opposing or trying to grab attention. You're really explaining things. And I want to share, and I'm going to have her share this first before we get into some of the topics. She herself, before we started recording, said, I actually do a lot of the things like the age optimizing things or the eating this way. But when you look at the masses and how to solve a problem, it's a little bit different. Can you elaborate on that? Just like on how you live and what you teach?
Yeah, sure. So I call it like the difference between individual health and public health, right? And I think probably a lot of your listeners, we spend a lot of time thinking about individual health, right? How can we really optimize our own health? And I think that's wonderful. And I'm not setting that aside by trying to talk about public health. I just want us to understand the difference. So for me in my own life, and I kind of mentioned this before we got on, I have a pretty aggressive like wellness routine. Like I've worked out my entire life. I work out most days. I try to lift as heavy as I can. I'm not very strong, but I do all of those things. I eat a really nutrient dense diet. My kids eat a really nutrient dense diet. I try to get outside each day. I try to decrease stress, which is not easy with two little kids. I have a 2 and a 5-year-old, but as much as possible, get enough sleep. I don't do well with that either, but you understand. So we have all of these buckets, like what impacts our health, what impacts our longevity, those types of things, right? When you look at it from a public health perspective, you have to think public health is not about these like individual behaviors. It's about how do we help people on a systemic level? How do we address the barriers that are impacting these people from being able to do these things, right? So if we look at the United States of America, for example, you'll hear statistics about our life expectancy, our chronic disease rates, but we as Americans do not experience those like equally. So it's not evenly distributed across the United States. And so, some examples I can give you just in life expectancy. There's research to show that if you look at the highest income brackets versus the lowest income brackets in the US, there's a 15-year life expectancy age gap for men and a 10-year life expectancy age gap for women between those brackets. 13.5% of our country is living in food insecure households, which are households that don't always have access to the nutrients that they need to meet their needs. And that includes 1 in 5 children. And so, a lot of times we kind of don't realize that a lot of people are living in areas. I just talked to a woman earlier today in my DMs who they don't qualify for SNAP, which is a nutrition assistance program. So they have very little money left for groceries at the end of the month. And so she told me that her and her husband rely on like toast and cereal to get through the week to make sure that their kids have food, right? So this is what a lot of Americans are dealing with. So when we talk about public health, we have to look at who's being affected the most by chronic disease, by low life expectancy, by all of these lifestyle related diseases. And then what can we do for those groups of people to make sure that they have their basic needs met? They have access to food, they have access to housing, they have access to safe drinking water, those types of things. And that's going to make the most meaningful impact on a public health level on improving people's health.
That really resonated with me. I saw your post today when you shared that on your stories, and I was thinking back to this trip. We went on a mission trip a few years back, me and my husband, to Nicaragua, and it was really, really poverty-stricken area. And we were there to help build houses and help bring in food. And they put these food kits together of all stuff I would never eat. Like, I was looking at it, it was this huge thing of canola oil and a big thing of pasta and like a can of, it was just stuff I wouldn't eat. And I remember being like really upset, like, why are we giving them this food? Like, what's going on? Like, and what I learned is that how hard it would be to even get them to have fresh vegetables or to have protein. Like, it was almost near impossible to get this food in. So we have to feed them something. So it was like, that was the first experience I had with, okay, well, how do we make this better? But just shaming and saying you can't have these foods, you shouldn't eat this, is not going to fix the problem. So your post today with that woman reminded me a little bit of that. I think we do get in our bubble and we're thinking of optimizing our own health or our friend circle's health, but we really are not looking at the whole big picture, and that doesn't solve the whole big problem. So
yeah. And I think the issue comes into play when we think that like what's working for us is going to work at a mass scale level in the US.
Yeah.
Right. Because as you say with the canola oil example, well, how cheap is canola oil compared to like a really high quality olive oil? Right. So it's much cheaper. And so if people need kind of an oil source, that's the oil source that is going to be like accessible for the most people in the US.
Yeah. And if you want to get really technical there, you start shipping olive oil or trying to store, and then you got all these rules there now too. Like, well, because there's all these theories about olive oil and how long that lasts and can it be this? So there's all these layers to it. So let's I want to jump into some of the specific things. Like, I want to start with food coloring, and I had my own belief around this. So I want to talk to you about what's real there, what's your opinion there. And I'll share, when I was in Europe last summer, one thing I really did notice was simplified, not perfect, but simplified ingredients in a lot of packaged foods. What are your thoughts here? Like, what's real about what's allowed in Europe versus here? And what is your take on food coloring?
Yeah. So I think let's start with kind of like the difference between here and Europe, because you bring up a good example. My husband is from Romania. He moved here in his 20s. So we go back most summers. Mm-hmm. And so I've spent a lot of time in different European countries. And there is definitely a difference in their food environment versus our food environment. And it's not just about them using food colorings. It's also just they have small markets everywhere, right? They have good local food systems. They have pretty accessible like produce and fruits and vegetables. It's just a totally different food system than we have here. When we're talking about artificial food dyes, I want to just kind of talk through some of the like common things that I see. So let me just explain first of all, like what artificial food dyes are, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's perfect.
So we have synthetic food dyes, and then we have naturally derived food dyes. And synthetic food dyes, there's 9 of them that are used that are approved for use in the US. Mm-hmm. One, which is red dye 3, which most people are probably familiar with, just got banned last year by the FDA. It's still in the food supply, so I just kind of like counted in that 9. But there's only 5 that are really used. So used abundantly in our food supply, and that's red 40, yellow 5, and yellow 6, blue 1, and blue 2. So those are the 5 that are like predominantly, if you look at packaged foods, you're going to see those synthetic food dyes. Why are they used? Because they're used in predominantly ultra-processed foods, and I can define that if we want to.
Yeah, I would love your definition on that too. Yeah.
Yeah. So the term ultra-processed foods comes from this NOVA classification in nutrition science, and it's a relatively new term, but it basically is foods that you couldn't replicate in your own kitchen because they rely on ingredients or food processing methods that you don't have access to. So the best way, there's 4 different classifications. Best way I can explain it is using corn. So unprocessed would be corn that you pick from the garden. Minimally processed would be like frozen corn. So they just flash freeze it, and because that goes through a little bit of processing. Processed would be like canned corn, and then ultra processed would be a Dorito chip, right? Yeah. So you're not going to be able to make Doritos in your kitchen because they, processing methods and ingredients that you don't have access to. So that's what ultra processed is. Most of the time when we see these food dyes, these synthetic food dyes, they're used in these ultra processed foods, right? That as a dietitian, as a PhD in
Mhm.
nutrition, I'm recommending that we consume less of anyway. Why are they used? Because when foods go through that processing from a food science perspective, they lose color. Like
Mhm.
they go through a lot of processing, it loses color. We know from a lot of literature that color is very important to the experience of eating food, right? So people who bright colored food, people look at it and they think, oh, that's going to taste better. That's going to be more flavorful. It's like this psychological thing that
We
we
do that
all
with real
see. Like we're
food,
like,
real natural food too,
we
like
do it with real
fruits,
food.
vegetables. Yeah.
Yes. That's why they add color to salmon, because people won't want to buy the
Wow.
like less colorful salmon, right? They think brighter orange means better and fresher. And so they add color into some of that salmon. And that's why it's a psychological experience of eating. And so these food corporations know that. They know that if they give you like brown whatever it is that should look colorful, that you're not going to want to eat it as much. And so they add these colors back. Now, synthetic food dyes, as opposed to natural food dyes, they are less, well, I guess natural food dyes are less stable and the appearance can vary depending on like the growing season.
Is that
And
like
so
when you use
consumers
like a
don't.
beetroot or something like that? What?
Yeah, like a
Okay.
beetroot. So a example is like red dye 40 would be the synthetic, but the natural version would be either beetroot or carmine, which comes from bugs, insects, like
Yeah.
it's a part of the insect, but it's still a natural dye that can be used. But those natural dyes, right, they can vary, and consumers don't tend to like when it's like a consumer preference thing. They don't like to tend to like when they get one bag of whatever it is, and then the
Mhm.
next time they get it, the color's a
Yeah.
little off. Because when the color's a little off, quote unquote, which is a commonly used term when they do these like surveys for people who are eating these foods, it makes people not want to eat them because they think it's bad.
You shared an example. I think it was General Mills. It was one of the companies. You said
Yeah.
they did like share that example. Somebody had done a
Sure.
voluntary change and then people didn't want it.
Yeah. So in 2015, because of consumer demand, what they thought was consumer demand, right, which came from a
Right.
lot of like what we're seeing now, consumer demand, right, for different a change in products. General Mills was like, okay, we're gonna take out as like they did it for marketing. This is why like this is why corporations do what they do. Their number one goal is profit, right, profit and growth. So they're gonna do what they think sells
Mhm.
best. They're not really interested in your health for the most part. So they were like, we're going to take out these artificial dyes and put in these natural dyes. And they had a whole marketing plan about it. And they did that in 2015. And within 2 years, they ended up adding the artificial dyes back. And it was because they had a lot of consumer backlash. They had a lot of consumers saying that the cereal looked quote unquote off or gross. And so they put it back because that's what consumers demanded. So it turned out that the consumers who were actually
Mhm.
eating, the Tricks, the Lucky Charms, those types of cereals, they wanted the really bright cereal. And that's what they were buying.
And I remember this from being with my daughter I mean, my daughter's almost 18 now, but when she was little, that I would go buy the natural version of things and she would say, "Ew, like this isn't what my friends have at school." It's like even with little kids
Yeah.
not knowing, it's just where their eyes are going. So, what's your thought process on the whole idea? And I know it wasn't actually a ban, it was a suggestion, but could you share kind of your insight on this divide around food coloring, which I didn't even realize was such a big divide, but apparently it is. Like, what is your thoughts there on why people were so divided and what actually should be happening?
Yeah, so I think going back to like the Europe versus here.
Mhm.
So I mentioned we have those 5 food dyes that we use in the United States. I think a big talking point that a lot of people believe is that these food dyes are banned in Europe or
Mhm.
other countries. And so some of the videos I do is correcting that, because
Yeah.
the idea that we in the United States don't ban these dyes because there's all this data out there to show they're unsafe where other countries are is just false. So all 5 of those dyes that I mentioned that are
Mhm.
predominantly used in our food supply are completely approved for use and deemed safe in all EU
Wow.
countries. The EFSA has deemed them safe. In Australia and New Zealand, their regulatory body has deemed them safe. Health Canada, their regulatory body has deemed them safe. And I think that will be surprising to some people to hear. And you can fact check me on this.
Yeah.
Like you can go to the actual like websites and see. You can go to
Which
the
I
EFSA
did, you
website
all.
and
I
pull up
did.
everyone.
I did because
Yeah.
this was all new. I'm like, how do I not know this? So I did. I went and looked at all of your stuff and fact checked all of it. And
Yeah,
it
and
was
I
wild.
always welcome people to fact check what I'm saying. I think we should do that because it helps us to like kind of get to the actual truth, right? So I'll make a video correcting that and being like, no, these dyes are not banned in other countries, and I'll get a lot of pushback being like, well, you're pro food dye, and what I say to that, I'm not pro food dye. Actually, I would recommend that we eat less foods that have these food
Mhm.
dyes in them, but I'm pro like why that narrative is so harmful is it plays into this narrative that scientists here corrupt, or they're not kind of like going through the proper regulatory process, when we are literally coming out with the same exact recommendations as these other countries. So then the question is, why are we different than these other countries? Why do you see Fruit Loops in
Mm-hmm.
Canada that are not as dyed versus us having these synthetic dyes? And that comes down to much more about consumer preference, right? In the
Mm.
United States, culturally, we are used to these really bright dyed cereals, right? So like I grew up in the 90s. I was a kid in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And like I remember lots and lots of commercials of these, like they all had mascots, and
Yep.
there was just the marketing to kids is
Of
just
course,
incessant.
tricks
And
are
that's
for
one of the
kids.
things.
Oh, I
Yeah,
remember.
tricks
Oh,
are for kids. Or I mean, even all these processed food companies, they're like, you can't eat just, bet you can't eat just
yeah.
one, right? They're like telling you that their goal is for you to eat
Yeah.
as much as possible. And so artificial food dyes are absolutely a marketing thing for these companies, but that's very different than them being dangerous from a scientific perspective. And so that's just the difference that I
Yeah.
want to get at. Like I can be for like getting rid of some of these food dyes, but I also want the honest conversation about why we're doing it, not because they're super dangerous and we're poisoning, our people while
Sure.
Europe is not. It's much more of a consumer preference thing.
And just to make sure we're all clear, you're not telling people go eat lots of food coloring or because that would be
No, of
eat
course
lots
not.
of ultra processed food. You're not a fan of that. You're just saying of
No.
all the things going on, we're not sharing the real information about that. Like we're not sharing the real facts about food coloring. We're thinking that that's just going to solve a problem and that these are so dangerous and they're banned everywhere else. And you're saying they're not banned everywhere else. They're not as dangerous as everyone thinks. And that's not our problem. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think it's that they're not banned everywhere else, number
Mm-hmm.
one. The evidence that we do have, I mean, food coloring is regulated by the FDA, and we can talk about the FDA because I actually prefer to critique the FDA than be
Yeah.
in defense of the FDA. I found myself being in defense of them more and more lately, but there are issues with the FDA, right? But with this particular topic, they're regulated by the FDA, just like they are by the
Mm-hmm.
EFSA or Health Canada or these other regulatory bodies. And the data that we have shows that they're safe, overwhelmingly shows that they're safe. And I can kind of even talk about how we decide on their safety. It comes from
Mm-hmm.
toxicology studies. We look at something called an ADI, which is how much somebody can have in a day. That's, the acceptable daily intake is what that stands for.
Yep.
And that's set based on something called an NOAEL, which is the no observed adverse effect level. And so what they do is they look at all these toxicology studies and they find what level in rats or in animal models can these animals consume these, let's say red dye 40. At what level can they consume red dye 40 with no adverse effect, like no observable adverse effects, looking at genotoxicity, looking at reproductive issues, looking at all of these different things. And then they find that level. And then they add a safety factor to that level. So for example, 100, they'll put in 100, and that's for like variability between species and just to be like extra, extra safe. So they'll take a number and then divide that number by 100 and then come to an ADI, which is the
Yes.
allowable intake in the day. And so an example is red dye 40. What studies have shown, the EFSA and the FDA have seen with red dye 40 is they found that no observable adverse effect level at 695 milligrams per kilogram. That was what they found in the toxicology studies. They divided that by 100. They got to 6.95 milligrams per kilogram. And so the ADI is set at 7 milligrams per kilogram. That's the ADI.
Okay.
Now, this will vary a little bit depending on the
Mm-hmm.
country. In the United States, actually, for 3 out of the 5 food dyes that are used, we have a lower ADI in the US than in the EU. And so again, that's the ADI, but the ADI
Right.
is already super, super conservative. Right. And so at those levels that are allowed in our food, there's just been no adverse effects we're seeing. And that's why it's allowed.
I'm just thinking about growing up. I grew up in the 70s, you grew up in the 90s, and we used to have in our pantry the whole spectrum of food colorings, probably ones that we definitely don't use now. And I remember making pancakes for breakfast and we would make them purple or red or whatever. Like we used to like dump them in our food at a whole different level, which is wild. So if I hear you correct, like all the things that we had years ago aren't even necessarily in our diet right now, but now we're getting really nitpicky here. And we're saying if we just pull food coloring, that this is going to fix our whole problem. What do you want people to know about that?
Yeah. So I think, think about the foods that food colorings are in, right? So these synthetic food dyes, again, they're in these, generally in these nutrient devoid ultra processed foods that I'm sure you would recommend people eat less of. I recommend people eat less of. And, like let's say Skittles.
Yep.
If you take red dye 40 in Skittles and you swap it for Carmine or beet juice, right?
Okay.
A natural dye, it's still Skittles.
Yeah.
It's still a candy. It's still a high sugar, nutrient devoid, ultra processed food that we would recommend consuming less of. On the flip side of that, potentially, there's not a lot of data to suggest this, but just from like a psychological perspective, and what could happen is that because they're not so bright, maybe kids start eating less Skittles.
Yep.
I would love to see like some research done on that because that could be a really good reason to actually
That makes
start
sense.
taking out, but like let's talk about that as the
So you would
reason
get
instead
behind
of
that
these are
reason. That makes sense. You would have gotten behind that. Like if the conversation was, how do we make these foods less appealing to kids? Let's
yeah.
dull the colors. You would have been like, that makes sense. You like that. It was just making
Yeah.
it the story that these are so harmful and these are so bad and they're allowed everywhere else.
Yeah. Or by the way, so there is a little bit of evidence to show that potentially these dyes exacerbate symptoms of ADHD in children with ADHD, right? A small subset of children with ADHD. It's some
Yes.
correlational data and it is there. And I hear from parents a lot like, oh, when I removed these dyes, my kid felt so much better. That observational data is very important to then go in and do even more research. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying we just say these are safe, let's continue using them, but let's like look at what's happening and then let's do more research. Let's not like misconstrue the research and
Yeah.
say that they're super dangerous and they're causing ADHD in children because there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that. There is a little bit of evidence to suggest that their removal might help a small subset of kids with ADHD. That research is very difficult to parse because of the types of foods that these
Yeah, because
dyes are
now we're
in.
looking at a high sugar diet and all this. So there's a lot of
Correct.
other things. So it's hard to know, was it that or was it the sugar that went with it? It's hard to know
Yeah,
now.
I mean, if you take out artificial dyes from your diet, like what are you taking out? You're taking
Right.
out things like Skittles and, these like high sugar cereals and things like that. And so, yeah, your diet quality is going to improve when you do that.
I just had a complete flashback as you were talking about the natural one, the carmine that's made from bugs. When in the 70s at camp, we used to drink Kool-Aid and they used to call it bug juice. And the reason they called it bug juice is I think they had tried to make it with that initially. And then there was
Oh,
backlash around that. So it's like
is that
anytime,
why? I didn't even know
yeah,
that.
because we used to call it bug juice. I just had this whole
Yeah.
memory of that. That makes sense why. So if food coloring were to get completely removed from foods, do you think it's a bad thing or you just don't like how people are explaining it?
Well, okay, so there are some downsides, which I just kind of mentioned with
Yep.
these natural dyes. So, kind of natural, this idea that natural is always better is actually not true. Like with carmine, for example,
Mhm.
carmine is quite allergenic. So, a lot of people will be more people than who are even like affected by synthetic dyes will be affected by natural dyes because it's a higher allergenicity.
Makes sense.
And so, some kids who maybe could tolerate Skittles if they have synthetic dyes won't be able to if they have some of these natural dyes. Again, I kind of already mentioned they
Yep.
have those issues with like texture. They like because they have the issue of the appear or the stability issue. It can affect the texture of the food, which some people are going to not love. Like there will be plenty of people who don't like the alternative to what
Yeah.
the synthetic dye food looks like. So those are some downsides. I think that, right now, the narrative kind of is that we don't have any choice right now. Like, I just want to mention, like, we do have choices. Like,
Mhm.
right now, like, I can go to my local Kroger, which is called, I'm in Denver, so it's called King Supers, and you can either buy the Fruit Loops or you can buy Fruitful O's, which are,
Yeah.
these naturally dyed. You can go to Aldi or Trader Joe's, and there's no artificial dyes used in their,
We
like,
could
main
vote with our
products, even
dollar.
Whole Foods.
You could still vote with
Yeah,
your
yeah.
dollar. Like if you don't
You
want a certain food, you buy the more natural one and you're paying those companies.
Yeah, for a subset of the population.
Yes.
Again, we get back to public health, and
Yep.
not everybody gets to choose the higher priced option, and that's another downside, potential downside. These are things are so nuanced. I'm so sorry that I'm like kind
No,
of
it's
talking around
okay.
it, but the natural dyes are also more expensive, right? So
Yes.
it's going to increase the product price.
If I think
Yeah,
of
go
like
ahead.
some of my friends or some of my other guests that I've had on here or other people that I've interviewed around these topics, what they would say is that they would say, well, what about the people that can't afford it? We need to protect them. We need to remove it to protect them. But if I'm
Yep.
hearing you correctly, okay, fine, but we're not claiming the right reasons. We need to, maybe that's good, but is it going to then not be as appealing? Are they not going to want to get it? Great. Those are good things. But to say that these are banned in other countries is just not true information. So we want to be truthful there. And then to avoid the fact that the other natural ingredients might create another problem, we have to be aware of that too.
Yeah, yeah. And if we're looking to, I think an even bigger issue is if we're looking to protect low income populations in this country, banning artificial food dyes is not even on the list of the first 25 things we should do.
Mm. Okay, good. Okay, I'm going to come back to that because I want to go deeper there, but I want to ask you about some of the other hot topics. And these are close to me. So I'm putting myself out there asking these questions because I've done lots of episodes on being against some of these things. I want to talk about seed oils because I've been for years, before any of this became political or popular. In my first book, I talk about not having them. I talk about focusing on olive oil and avocado oil. And then if you're going to have real fats, maybe butter. I still am not a huge fan of the high levels of saturated fat for some people. So this is something that I talked about for years. Now it's become this very divisive topic. So I want to get your shares, your research, your data on what do we really need to be concerned about with oils versus what's just been overkill.
Sure. Okay. So when you talk about kind of recommending olive oil and avocado oil, and was there another oil
I
in
said
there?
real butter sometimes if you're going to choose. So maybe real butter
Okay.
or ghee.
Maybe coconut oil.
Coconut oil would be another
You
one.
say
I
that
mean,
too?
I tend to not love the saturated fats as much, but
Yeah.
yes, I would say more natural coconut oil or butter or ghee versus canola oil or vegetable oil or seed oils.
Yeah. And why do you recommend that?
Well, I recommend, first of all, the avocado and the olive to me is the most heart healthy. It's going to give us good fats and we get benefits from that. So, and as somebody who has familial, the high cholesterol genetically.
So high cholesterol.
Something that I've just been monitoring for years and to keep my HDL well, I'm just very aware of that. So, and then it's more natural. And then I don't love the highly processed because I've always taught lessening the processed food in your diet. So I look at some of these oils as not like we wouldn't really go squeeze cotton to make oil. So cottonseed oil would not be something that makes sense. So that's me. I can't tell you like, here's all the science data. I can go find science data, but I really want to open up this conversation and understand like, where do we need to be concerned about this versus this is an overkill?
Yeah, so I agree with you. So when we looking at like our fat sources, there's an immense amount of data that, things like olive oil, things like avocado oil, things that have more polyunsaturated, monounsaturated fatty acids versus saturated fatty acids are more heart healthy, are more beneficial. Seed oils, actually, the fatty acid composition of them in and of itself are what we would consider a heart healthy oil because they are full of polyunsaturated fats, a little bit of monounsaturated fats, very little saturated fat. So when you're just looking at fatty acid composition, and that's why in the dietary guidelines, they're actually added into there because the dietary guidelines are supposed to be for all Americans.
Okay.
What are we looking for? So seed oils are one of those polyunsaturated fatty acids. Now, from a processing perspective and a nutrient perspective, seed oils are lowest on the list in terms of nutrients, right? Because they're very, very processed and they're kind of like stripped of their nutrients, so to speak. We're not like pressing out a sunflower seed, right? Because that's what seed oils are. They come from like sunflower and safflower and rape seeds, which is canola oil. So again, from a fatty acid perspective, the research is actually quite good on them being heart healthy and heart protective. If you look at data kind of swapping out saturated fats and putting in polyunsaturated fats from things like seed oils, it's actually quite beneficial for decreasing cholesterol, decreasing cardiovascular risk, even some research showing decreasing all-cause mortality. But they are very low on the list for nutrients. So if you're looking for your oils to be the most nutrient dense as possible, seed oils are not going to be that, right? Your options are going to be more like olive oil, more like avocado oil, those types of things that are going to retain some of their nutrients. That's more of like an optimizing thing, right?
Okay.
So let's look at like what are the best oils that we could be recommending to people if they have the means, if they don't have a lot of barriers. From a taste perspective, olive oil is way better than like actually this is a funny story. My son loves like olive oil and balsamic and it's like his favorite thing to eat. So he was really cute. He's 5. He just went, this was like a couple days ago, and he went and took what he thought was olive oil, but it was actually my mother-in-law's like vegetable oil that was in my pantry. And he got that and he poured it in a little like bowl for himself with some balsamic and then dipped bread. And he was like, "Mommy, this is terrible."
Yeah.
And so, it's not as flavorful.
Yeah. No, I love the taste of olive oil, but I hear what you're saying. It's more expensive. And so not everyone has their hands on that.
Yeah. And just when we look at the actual data on seed oils, there's just not evidence that these oils are harmful. Now, they are refined oils. So again, they're not going to be nutrient dense oils, but from a heart healthy perspective, they're actually quite heart healthy. If you look at globally, populations all around the world use these oils a lot. In Japan, canola oil is the number one oil used. Japan is we often like compare our life expectancy and our health status to like Japan, but they use a lot of these seed oils.
So have you heard of Kate Shanahan or Dark Calories, or have you read any of some of the studies around seed oils? I mean, I know, again, you know more about a lot of this than me as far as data. So I'm just curious, like some of the And I've had many guests on also here
Yeah.
about seed oils. So are you saying some of the claims that people are making about seed oils being actually wreaking havoc on our heart health and all, you don't feel that those are accurate? You think, or do you think that some are accurate, or any oil in a lot of what's your take on that? Because I'm sure you've read research looking at the other
Yeah, of
direction.
course. Of course. So epidemiological data doesn't support that, right? But that's epidemiological data.
Can
When
you
we
explain
look
what that
at
means? Because some people don't know what that means.
Yeah, sure. So that's like long-term longitudinal data where we're looking at really large data sets and we're seeing, okay, and it's correlational, right?
Hmm.
For the most part. So we're looking at, okay, what populations eat a lot of seed oils and then what populations don't eat a lot of seed oils. Maybe they eat more saturated fat. And what are the health outcomes when we control for a bunch of other factors, right? So it's like you get these huge data sets, thousands and thousands of people, and then you statistically control for like, poverty level or income level and, other lifestyle factors that might affect what you're looking for. So if you're looking at like heart health, what other things impact heart health, control for as much as that as possible, and then kind of like see the impact of these oils. And so when you look at those large data sets, there's no evidence that seed oil intake like impacts this. When you look at some of the other evidence of like just looking at the polyunsaturated fatty acids and if
Hmm.
they're causing inflammation.
Yep.
Yeah. So looking at like, I think there's some studies looking at linoleic acid and how that breaks down to arachidonic acid. Yeah. And how it oxidizes. But when you actually see that like in vivo, like in actual human trials or human studies, the amount of arachidonic acid that comes from the seed oil is very, very small.
Mhm.
So it's not. So when you think about like from a systemic perspective, causing inflammation, it just doesn't hold up in the research. Like honestly, this flies in the face of nutrition science research. So it's really difficult for me to like kind of like with like artificial dyes, there's a lot of nuance there.
Right.
With seed oils, there's just not great evidence that it's harmful for us.
So
What there is evidence on, if I can just mention
yeah,
this, we overconsume seed oils in the United States, and that's very problematic.
that's what I was
So
just going to
seed
say.
oils,
Yeah. Here's what I feel. And I did an
yeah.
experiment with myself, just cutting out literally all seed oils. And what I realized is the seed oils weren't happening at my house. They were happening eating out, because I started asking, because I wanted to
Mhm.
see what happened on my labs, what would change on my markers if I did this. And I did notice a change on my markers. But here's the problem with even just going off of my own little personal study with myself is I'm not counting in, we're eating out. Like you're eating out. What else is going into that food? You're having more calories. You're having more things added. So you're getting into more ultra processed. There's more things happening. So there's a lot of variables going into, it's not just the trace amount of seed oil that's in something. It's how much are you having? Are you having French fries that are now fried in it? And that's an excessive amount.
Correct. Well, yeah, and frying with seed oils is problematic, right? Especially not necessarily just like frying one time, but especially like at fast food restaurants that continue to reuse it.
Yes.
That can be really problematic because that can oxidize and turn into trans fats, which is actually very problematic for heart health. And
Okay,
so,
so there right there, what you just said there, that is the key to all this that I think people have completely taken out of context and made it the wrong way. So what you just said, everybody, that's the agreement line. So no matter what side people fall on seed oils, what you just said there about it oxidizing and creating
mhm.
inflammation, that is the key thing. But where people have taken it to this extreme now is the tiny trace amount that's in a healthier snack or something like that,
Yeah, or
I think.
even just like at home using canola oil to like saute something. That's just not, there's just no evidence to suggest that that's harmful for like people who that's what they can afford is canola oil and that's what they're using to saute. I want to get back to this point about how we overconsume it though, because seed oils are abundant in our food supply. Our food environment, which we could talk about our food
Mhm.
environment too, but our food environment is like 70% ultra processed foods right now, right? And
Yeah.
we have this is somewhere where I think we all can agree too. Like our food environment is terrible. We need to start doing things to improve our food environment so that people have more access to healthier options. But within that ultra processed food, most of these companies are using seed oils. Why? A couple of reasons. They're cheap because they're so processed,
Yep.
but they're also flavorless, right? For the most part, like we just talked about how flavorful like olive oil is. Well, you don't want olive oil in some of these processed snacks because it's going to overpower in
Yes.
terms of flavor. So they use canola oil or safflower oil or whatever it is to vegetable oils to as the fat source in these products. And because we are over consuming ultra processed foods, we're over consuming, restaurant foods where they're using these seed oils, we're over consuming polyunsaturated fatty acids and seed oils. And
So
that is problematic.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, if you're having a big salad at home you're not dumping canola oil all over it. You yourself would love olive oil. You would love to have the more natural. You're just saying there's been a little bit of an overreaction, or maybe in some cases a big overreaction on the dangers of it, when the specific danger of it is when you're frying it, when you're over consuming, when it's oxidizing, when it's creating inflammation. So that you agree with. It's just gotten into this crazy zone. And I noticed this came up for me where I downloaded an app that would tell me what restaurants had seed oils or not. And I noticed some of the healthy restaurants, even like Flower Child, came up high levels of seed oils. And I'm like, but wait a minute, but their stuff is healthy. So this is where, all these little nuances. And I'm thinking, well, is it better to have Flower Child or McDonald's? Probably Flower Child. But now they're saying they have seed oil. So it gets very confusing for people.
Yeah, I think that's a really good distinction that you're making there, because is it healthier to have Flower Child or McDonald's? Like, there's an obvious answer there, right? Because one is using a lot of like fresh, nutrient dense foods. And so this is kind of where these types of conversations or these types of like this type of rhetoric can actually be really harmful. Because like if you're being put in the position like, oh my gosh, both of these are equally bad, like it's clear, like, that's clearly not the case, where one is much more nutrient dense. And seed oils, again, when we look at the data and we look at long-term longitudinal data and we look at the large scale data, there's just not evidence that these seed oils are harmful to human health. And actually quite the opposite we see, because of their polyunsaturated fatty acid profile. If people over consuming saturated fat, for example, it can be heart protective. And so, it's not the first oil that you would recommend because of like the nutrient density of it. But it's also not something that I would say, like, if it's like this beautiful, like sauteed, what is it called? Like stir fry with all of these veggies and these nutrient dense foods, and it was made with a little seed oil, that's not taking away from the nutrient density of the meal.
Makes total sense. Because if all of a sudden Dunkin' Donuts and McDonald's start saying seed oil free, but it's like flour. It's just, that's where this goes very bad.
What's the fast food restaurant that just switched out seed oils for beef tallow?
Oh God, I don't know.
Steak and Shake. I don't know. I don't want to name somebody. I'm not sure, but one of the fast food restaurants, like that doesn't make. I think it's like the psychological thing. People are like, oh, because there's no seed oil and now there's beef tallow. Which, by the way, we don't have any evidence to suggest beef tallow is more beneficial for heart health than seed oils. That doesn't automatically make that fast food any healthier.
And this argument, by the way,
that's important to know.
By the way, and I have a cardiologist coming on soon that I'm going to be interviewing, but about this, because there's been this argument about what actually causes heart disease has been going on for years. Some people blame sugar, some people blame saturated fats and cholesterol. It's like this has been going on since the 70s, back Ansel Keys. It's like these is going back forever. And I think the seed oil is going to be one of those new topics where we have these different sides. So I like that truth in the middle, that yes, when it oxidizes, when it creates inflammation, when it's too much, and when it's ultra processed, that's the bigger problem there. So we agree there. And plus, like you said, there's benefit. Like olive oil has polyphenols. You're going to get benefits from some of these other oils too. Let's talk about another trendy one, but another one that I'm guilty of talking about. And I want to ask about raw milk. And I want to share where my stance on raw milk came first, and then you can help with some of the science here. So in my experience, a lot of midlife women that feel that they're lactose intolerant or are lactose intolerant, when they actually consume raw milk, they don't have that same reaction. And it was my understanding it's because when it's not pasteurized, the enzymes are not broken down, so they're fully intact. So you get the complete enzyme, and that's why you don't have an issue with raw milk. However, I'm also very aware that if you have raw milk, you have a higher risk of parasites or bacteria or things that are not getting killed off. So what's going on here with the raw milk? Why is it banned in some states and not in others? What's your opinion on it? And is it stupid to drink it? Is it healthy for some? But help us with your opinion and also some of the science here.
So raw milk is, I'll just define it. Raw milk is just a milk that comes from the cow, and it doesn't go through pasteurization. Pasteurization is essentially just heating the milk in order to kill harmful pathogens. So the most common way to pasteurize is you heat the milk for 15 seconds, not even to boiling. It's 165 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 seconds, and then you rapidly cool it. And that's it. That's the pasteurization process. And the whole point is just to kill potentially harmful pathogens, right? And so this idea of pasteurization or cooking our food in order to decrease risk has, we used to drink a lot of raw milk, and there was a reason that we started pasteurizing, right? And that reason is because people were getting sick from foodborne illness. And so there's a reason we cook our meat, right? We cook our meat because meat has the potential to make us sick if we eat it raw. And so cooking it significantly decreases that risk of getting foodborne illness.
Okay.
With raw milk, if you pasteurize your milk, it significantly reduces the risk of foodborne illness. I mean, there's some evidence to suggest that raw milk is 840 times more likely to cause foodborne illness than pasteurized. So it's a much riskier thing to do. If you want to choose that risk, that, I think that can be your decision. So there was like, I don't know exactly back in history, but at some point, very early on, like 100 years ago or something, we made the decision as a country that we weren't going to allow the sale of raw milk anymore because it was so dangerous compared to the pasteurized version, which is, again, it's just heating for 15 seconds and rapidly cooling it. So lots of states haven't changed that. Some states have, and they've kind of like changed their laws, but it kind of goes state by state, and they've kind of like started allowing that because it's more like, oh, your choice if you want to do this. The problem is if you think about it on an individual level, you can make that choice individually. Again, from a public health perspective, which is kind of how I think about these systems, if you stop pasteurizing milk and you just have raw milk kind of like all throughout our society, there's just going to be a ton more foodborne illness.
Especially if people are already eating a highly processed food diet, they don't have maybe the immune system or the health to really get rid of things that we could see more problems.
We would see way more problems. Yeah.
Is there what I just said about my belief and my understanding about you're not killing the enzymes? Do you see any holes in that? Is that a true thing? What's your thoughts around that? About like, because I'm literally not bloated if I eat raw, but if I eat the pasteurized, I would be bloated. So I'm wondering around that.
Yeah. So I've heard this a lot. I've looked for evidence on it, and there's not science on it, but that doesn't mean that it's not a real phenomenon. It's certainly because I've heard it so much and you've heard it so much, like it's clearly something. And I think we shouldn't like discount people's experiences. I think that those experiences, again, that's called observational data for us, that's used to then go do research and see, okay, why is this happening?
Yeah.
Right. So we don't know from a scientific perspective why that might be happening. That's a really good hypothesis that it's potentially that some of the enzymes are allowing kind of the enzymes within your gut to then be able to tolerate lactose more. I see sometimes that people say like, oh, well, raw milk has lactase, which allows you to break down the lactose. That's not accurate because your body makes lactase. The milk doesn't have lactase itself. So your body makes lactase. If your body downregulates lactase production, then you have lactose intolerance, right? Because lactase is that enzyme that breaks down lactose. So if there's potentially something in the raw milk that helps your endogenous systems build up more lactase to be able to handle the raw milk, that's a very interesting question that like I think we should study, but there's not data to suggest that that's true right now.
So you personally, would you drink or eat raw cheese or raw milk?
No,
you wouldn't, because from what you know.
No, because I don't drink milk anyway, so that I think my opinion's a little skewed. I wouldn't let my children drink it for sure, just because it's I get my this is kind of I get my milk from a local farm in Denver, but it's pasteurized.
Got it.
It's great. It's so good, but my kids love it. They won't even let me buy like the stuff at the store because it's not as like good tasting. But I think a lot of people think you can only get that good taste from raw milk, but you can get it from again, pasteurization is just heating.
I don't eat a lot of dairy at all, but if I am going to have cheese, especially when I was living in California, I would buy the raw because that would make it so I didn't feel that. But I hear what you're saying, that it's more individual, which is everything. A lot of things can be individual. Like it doesn't dismiss. Somebody listening might say, well, I feel this when I have this. That may be very well true for you. She's not dismissing that. She's just saying for the masses, we have to pay attention to these things. I want to ask you about, we had started talking about the FDA and your thoughts there. You said, I talk about them a lot. You defend them a lot. And then you also see some negatives. I'd love to get some of your guidance around that and what's actually important from your perspective. What do we need? What are we missing there? And what really does need to change?
So the FDA is the Food and Drug Administration. So they are housed within HHS, which is Health and Human Services. So they're housed under HHS with like the CDC and the USDA and the NIH and a bunch of other agencies. And so the FDA is really responsible for making sure that our food and our drug are safe for the population. Within the nutrition department of the FDA, it's a very small subset. So the vast majority of the FDA is kind of looking at the pharmaceutical industry and making sure that the pharmaceutical drugs in our country are safe. And then we have the food section of the FDA, which is making sure that our food is safe outside of like poultry and meat and things, which is housed under the USDA. So the FDA essentially that they are responsible for basically allowing different additives into our food supply, ensuring that they're safe, and then also, issuing recalls if things happen and those sorts of things. Just making sure like what we are consuming is safe. If there is evidence that, something that's on the market is not safe, they will go through the process to then take that off the market. So, a good example of that is like trans fats, like artificial trans fats. That's a more recent example. I think that was like back in
Yeah.
2015, so somewhere under the Obama administration.
Even
And
saccharin, I
so,
think saccharin had that to some extent. Was that part of that too? Like I know saccharin was like the big artificial sweetener of choice in the 70s and 80s.
yeah, and then it was taken off the
Yes.
market. Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's a similar thing. So red dye 3 is a really good example
Yep.
too. Red dye 3 was just taken off the market because a bunch of scientists kind of petitioned the FDA to look at the evidence
Mhm.
there. And so this was kind of like a unique situation. The evidence, it wasn't new evidence, it was old evidence that showed that a really high dose of red dye 40, about 4% of the body weight in male rats, caused tumors, thyroid tumors
Mm.
in those male rats. And so we have something called the Delaney Clause in the United States, which states that like if something has been shown to cause, which is a really important word, cause, like
Yep.
directly cause cancer in any model, human, animal, whatever,
Mhm.
at any dose, it needs to be taken off the market. And so that's kind of why red dye 3 was taken off, not because it had shown any evidence of harm in humans, but because of the Delaney Clause with those studies in rats. And so, yeah, that's kind of what the FDA does.
Do they do any? Well, what do they do wrong? Like, what do they? Well, because they're very villainized, and I mean, I certainly don't think they're perfect. But I want to ask you,
Yeah.
like, do you think they do anything wrong, or what? Like, 'cause there's a lot of
Yeah.
changes happening right now. So, and it's people are very divided here. So, I mean, do you think it's perfect? Do you think there's things that do wrong? What would be like your wish list with them?
Yeah. No, it's not perfect. Big reason why it's not perfect, though, and this is really important to understand, is it's chronically underfunded at the FDA. And so here's a thing that I really agree with, like RFK Jr. on. I really agree that we have an issue with what's called GRAS, the
Mhm.
GRAS loophole. So this is generally recognized as safe. It's a designation in the US where this loophole has allowed essentially a lot of ingredients in our food supply without proper FDA
Mhm.
oversight. And I say proper from like my perspective, what would be
Mhm.
proper? It's proper in terms of like how the FDA is set up right now. And I can kind of explain why that happened. So GRAS, the designation came in the 50s, 1958, and essentially it had really good intentions. So it was like FDA oversight and approval for new food additives kind of is a pretty rigorous process, right? And so they were like, let's have this designation that's generally recognized as safe for things like sugar and vinegar and flour, things that have been in the food supply forever and ever. And they don't need to go through this rigorous process for approval. And so those were designated as GRAS. And that's kind of how that approval
Mhm.
worked. In 1969, under Nixon, that he initiated this affirmation status. So, like, they went through all of the GRAS ingredients and said, okay, we have to make sure that they are affirmed. And they affirmed them as safe, as generally recognized as safe. And then until 1997, that's how it worked. So, if people wanted to go through GRAS status, they had to go through the FDA. They had to provide, if a company wanted a new ingredient, they had to provide the FDA all of the toxicology studies, all of the safety studies. And then the FDA would go through the approval process and either approve or deny. And then it would get that designation. In 1997, that changed under the Clinton administration. There was this really big push in the 80s and 90s for deregulation from both Republicans and Democrats. And it was like this just real big
Mhm.
deregulatory era. And I can talk about that with pharmaceuticals too. It happened with pharmaceuticals and with the FDA. They had something that kind of changed how they were approving drugs because it was just taking so long. Like there was huge backups. So
Mhm.
Congress wasn't approving enough funds for the FDA to have enough people. And so these companies really wanted more food additives in the food in there
Mhm.
to be able to be used. And they were like, you guys are taking too long. So essentially what they did, what the FDA did was they said, okay, you guys as corporations can essentially self-affirm that these food additives are safe. And what that means is it's not as bad as it sounds, but it's
Okay.
not great. So it means that the corporations could essentially hire their own scientists and go through the whole process of the affirmation process, find all of the safety studies with their own scientists that they hired, and say if something was safe or not. And they didn't even have to tell the FDA. So the FDA didn't no longer was like approving
Mhm.
things because there was
Wow.
this like big backup. And so what that did is it created this loophole where now that there's ingredients in our food supply that the FDA is not even aware of because they've gone through this self-affirmation process.
Mm.
Now, that seems ridiculous, and it is. But the reason for it was, again, the FDA had this like huge backup. So what RFK Jr. wants to do is close that GRAS loophole, which public health experts have been wanting to do forever as well, and they've been quite critical of this entire system, because it's really a pro corporation
Yep.
thing, not a pro public health thing, right? Like allowing these food corporations to just go faster essentially to
Yes.
get these food ingredients in. Now, if there's evidence of harm, again, the FDA will step in and they'll be like, oh my gosh, this particular ingredient is showing evidence of harm. You
Mhm.
petition the FDA goes through approval, but that's a reactionary approach, right? Whereas a lot of us would like them to take a more proactive approach and be like, okay, well, don't even allow it in the food supply unless it's been rigorously tested and shown to be safe.
Mm.
And so that is an area where I've always been quite critical of the FDA, and I think they deserve criticism. But it's not necessarily corruption at the FDA level. It's that they didn't have the capacity to go as fast as they wanted. And because we had administrations both in both
Yep.
parties who wanted kind of this pro corporation deregulatory agenda, that's why this happened.
Makes sense. Makes total
Yeah.
sense. I'm loving asking you these questions because, again, I've heard like completely different answers, but I love how you're explaining things, because what I'm realizing is you're actually more similar to other people that I've
I
interviewed
am.
than and everyone realizes. Like you actually have similar things. It's just the divide is coming into, you're very factual. Like, this is the fact. Let's talk about, like, you're saying this is what I do. Fine. But here's the facts here. And then also how do we help the masses here versus just how do we help the person that's already optimal and has the means to go to another level. So, but I realizing how similar things really are. It's just this different perspective here. You had said earlier that there was like 25 things, or there's a whole list of things that you would believe would be more of a priority. And you don't have to list all 25, but what would be, if you we're going to fix the health of this country, we want to really help people get healthier, what would kind of be your priority? What would you think we need to do?
Yeah, so I'll talk about it from like a individual health
Mm-hmm.
versus like systemic health, right? And so again, there's these categories, but let's just talk about food. So what would we recommend? This is probably similar to what you would recommend, right? Let's eat a diet that's mostly whole, nutrient dense foods. A lot of like vegetables and fruits and beans and legumes and a variety of meats, right? And limit ultra processed foods, limit added sugars, limit, all of these like refined carbohydrates, these types of things. That's like the gold standard of like nutrition advice, right?
Yep.
We complicate nutrition, but it's actually the basics have been the basics for a long, long time,
You know what's
right?
wild,
And there hasn't been a
Jessica?
lot of variety.
Just to interrupt for 1 second. I've had
Yeah.
this discussion having carnivores on or vegans on. Like, at the core, they're both saying eat unprocessed healthy food. But it's like, but there's big divide. I think it's the same thing happening right now. It's like you're still saying that. You're saying eat healthy, unprocessed, natural, real food for the most part.
Yeah, and I think, carnivores are over here, vegans are
Yeah.
over here. I think the truth falls somewhere in the middle, and I think the truth really is just like a variety of whole foods, like as best as we can. So that's the individual advice. If I'm working one-on-one with somebody, that's what I'm saying, right? But when you look at it from a public health perspective, again, you have to look at what are the root causes of not being able to do that. And so what are they? Well, let's talk about agricultural subsidies. So why are our dietary guidelines recommending people eat a variety of whole foods and making half of your plate fruits and vegetables, but we don't subsidize fruits and vegetables? Our subsidies go towards corn, wheat, and soy. We're a monoculture. We really prioritize corn, wheat, and soy in this country, and that's where the vast majority of our subsidies go. And subsidies are essentially like not necessarily direct payments to farmers as much anymore, but it's like crop insurance, right? So if like something happens, so we're investing in
Mhm.
corn, wheat, and soy. Well, why are we doing that? Well, we're doing that because corn is a very good export for us, right? It's all about money. So that's what is good financially for us. We made that decision back in the 70s. The Department of Agriculture made that decision to go big or get out. I think it was what he said, the Department of
Mhm.
Agriculture, and it essentially decimated small farms. So we had
Mm.
this major farm crisis through the late 70s and 80s, and we took away local food systems and we started really just prioritizing monoculture. Which is really bad for our soil, by the way. We used to have these wonderful diverse farms where like there was all this wonderful turnover and nutrient density in the soil.
Mhm.
And we just don't have that anymore. We have these giant agribusinesses and that's what we prioritize in the United States. And so why? Because corn is a really good export for us. The vast majority of corn, by the way, doesn't even go for our food in the United States. It goes towards animal agriculture, feeding animals, and it goes towards fuel. And so that's what we're prioritizing growing in the United States. So because of that, we actually have to import a lot of our like fruits and vegetables
Mhm.
and things like that. But if we want to tell people to make half of your plate fruits and vegetables, but we're not incentivizing the growing of that. So we're artificially, the corn, wheat, and soy that we do make goes into ultra processed foods to artificially make those things cheaper. And then produce in our country is quite expensive, right? Especially like
Yeah.
berries in the
Yeah.
winter.
Yeah.
Very expensive. So we are making it inaccessible to eat those nutrient dense foods through policy. Those are policy decisions. We have food deserts. We have millions and millions of people in this country living in what we call food deserts, which are areas that you don't have easily accessible. You can't get access to fresh fruits and vegetables easily. And I don't think a lot of people can conceptualize this who maybe haven't been into food deserts before, because I
Yeah.
certainly couldn't before I had been into one. I was talking to a colleague, and she went through this exercise where she worked with women, single moms who are in these food deserts, to try to go and get local fresh produce. And they had to take like 4 different buses to the
Yeah.
nearest
I've
store to
seen
get fresh
exactly what you're
produce.
talking about. And it
Yeah.
definitely, I mean, I saw that when I was in Nicaragua too. Like just when we were trying to help people, they're living in trash dump areas. Like there was literally no way to get that in or to find it. We couldn't even teach them how
Right.
to plant and grow it because the land is so bad right there.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so we have these issues, right, that are in our country. So how would you make those improvements? You would reform agricultural subsidies. You would strengthen local food systems, right? You would bring things in like these carts, these farmers market carts to these food deserts. You would incentivize small farmers. Like the farm bill just came out, and it does the exact opposite of that. And unfortunately, like, how would we strengthen local food systems? Incentivize small farmers to be able to produce a bunch of different crops, and afford some of these subsidies to smaller farmers that are growing things that aren't corn, wheat, and soy, right? And really investing in kind of like these local food environments. And that can help address food deserts, which I said lots of people, millions of Americans live in. Address things like what we call the social determinants of health, which are these non kind of medical factors that really directly impact health, like economic equality or economic instability, I should say. Built environment, which are like our cities and towns, which aren't really walkable or bikeable. And so people aren't able to get physical activity. But back to nutrition, investing in nutrition education from a young age, because a lot of people don't realize like how to eat well, right? And so again, we talked about like corporations make what people are buying. How do you increase demand? You start them young. You start teaching them young how to kind of make these food choices, and then you can increase demand by kind of like systemically through that way. So those are all like from a public
Yeah.
health perspective, how do we get people eating? How do we get people actually following these guidelines? Because over 90% of Americans aren't meeting vegetable
Mm-mm.
and fiber guidelines right now. Over 70% of Americans are eating more calories than what their needs are. Over 50% of Americans are eating too much added sugar. So we have the science, we have the guidelines. A lot of people aren't following them. Got to ask why, and then you have to address why.
Okay, now I'm going to ask you another, a bigger question here with the influencers that you see online and wellness influencers that I really do think have the right intention. Me included in this, where we have the right intention, where we're learning something, we're doing it for us, we share it. This is what we're doing. What do you want them to start paying attention to and looking at? Because like you said, this could work for them. This is great. This could be the ideal. It just doesn't work for everyone. What guidance would you have for them? Because I do believe most people that are in that category, they're online, they want to help. They're not doing it. They want to actually help, and they think they are helping. And like you've pointed out many times, it's making a lot of information more complicated. So what do you want them to know?
Well, I'll tell you why I got on social media to start with.
Mm-hmm.
It was because I was pregnant at the time, and I started realizing how much misinformation was targeting that demographic of
Mm,
people. So I saw lots of misinformation and kind of like fear-based information in the pregnancy space. And so I started just making content on like, food safety and things like, because that's a
mhm.
very big thing during
Yeah.
pregnancy. And so I think what a lot of people don't realize is that like sometimes these good intentions are like really rooted in like fear. And so that's why I think like these topics are really nuanced. And unfortunately, social media algorithms do not reward nuanced conversations, right? They reward really like
The echo
sensational.
chamber
Yeah, they
or they want to polarize. Like it's either the opposite or exactly what you believe.
Yeah, or if you have something really like sensational to say,
Mhm.
like they reward that because it's like, "Oh my gosh, what? Like I
Yeah.
didn't know that." Right? And most nutrition science is not sensational. It's like there's
Yeah.
just not that much sensation in it. And so, because of that, a lot of people will, whether it's good intentioned or not, they will over kind of speak of what they're saying, and that they
Mhm.
will go from like what maybe is, say, something that's not really rooted in science, and it causes a lot of fear,
Mm.
right? So, and that's, I get DMs every single day from people just literally terrified of like, I don't even know what to eat. And I just don't think we need to be doing that, right? And so that's kind of like when I go on and I'm correcting some of this misinformation, I really try to be very specific and target the information that's being said and just kind of correct what's being said, because it helps people when you can hear kind of like, oh, the glucose test is not toxic and is not going to like kill my baby, which, or like I corrected a video a couple months ago and she started the video by, are you poisoning your kids? And
Mm.
like, that's just not helpful, especially to a demographic of new parents that are just trying to do what's best for their kids. And, we all are parents. Well, we're not all parents, but we all like parents come in all shapes and sizes, right? They come in Democrat, they come Republican, they come in all like different
Mm-hmm.
areas, all different socioeconomic statuses. And all of us at the end of the day just want to do what's best for our children. But we don't want to be terrified that we can't feed our children like food and like, I buy some crackers for my kids, and because they have a little seed oil, my kid is gonna like be
Right.
poisoned. Like, that's just not true at the end of the day. So I think like being really careful that we are saying accurate things is like the most important thing on social media. And unfortunately, social media doesn't really reward
You're
accuracy.
right.
It rewards the most sensational thing that you say.
I think what I've taken from really researching lately, and I mean, gosh, your page was so helpful to me, just really opening my mind to an opposite side of how I'd been thinking and expanding my thoughts. I'll maybe that's a better word, expanding my thoughts. Is I feel with what I do, I want to be more accurate in saying this is what I do versus just like this is a blanket rule. So this is what I do, this is why, and versus like everyone needs to stop doing this. So that's what I took from that, because like you said, everything is very nuanced. There's kind of different sides, there's different levels of things, and you're not saying some of the things that wellness influencers or people are speaking about are necessarily not working for them. Like they might be working for them, but we just need to be careful about telling the masses that they have to do something or why something is good for the masses.
Yeah, I think that's really, really right. I also think it's why a lot of times, like people like me, I think this happens with a lot of registered dietitians who have, they've been thinking about these topics for a long
Mm-hmm.
time. And so they're very careful in their words, right? So like when we talk about ultra processed, like I'm very careful to talk about like, I don't just say processed foods are
Yeah.
terrible. Right. So I'm very careful to be like, we want to really avoid as much as possible. I'll always kind of like couch it in that,
Yeah.
like limit these. Don't just like necessarily avoid them all, because it's just not realistic for everyone in
Totally.
America to be avoiding ultra processed foods in a country that, incentivizes you to eat ultra processed foods, and it's your food environment 70% ultra processed foods. So I think, and that can get misconstrued sometimes by people as like, oh, ultra processed foods are like poisoning America. It's more because it's like a recognition that like not everyone can do this.
Right.
Not everyone can eat and optimize and biohack their health,
Yeah.
And so just kind of realizing that.
Jessica, this was so helpful. Where can people, I'm going to obviously link your Instagram below, but where do you want people to go to find you? Is that the best place? Instagram? Is there a website you'd rather them go to? Where do you want them to find more?
Yeah, my Instagram is probably the best place. I also have a Substack where I publish twice a week on different topics. So I don't really know it's just Jessica's Substack. I'm not sure. I should get better at that. But yeah, my Instagram is good to start.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you for today.